It was just another ordinary Monday morning at Lincoln High School. The bell rang sharply, signaling the start of first period. Students shuffled into Ms. Turner's history class, a mix of groggy teenagers still waking up and a few chatty ones already swapping stories from the weekend. Ms. Turner, a woman in her late 40s with a stern expression and a voice that commanded attention, stood at the front of the classroom, flipping through her lesson plans. For most students, this was just another day, but for one student in particular, it would be anything but. Sitting near the back of the room was Daniel, a quiet and thoughtful sophomore. Daniel had a reputation among his peers for being one of the sharpest minds in class, often asking questions that went beyond the textbook. But he also knew the unspoken rules of the classroom: keep your head down and don't draw attention to yourself, especially in Ms. Turner's class. She wasn't the kind of teacher you challenged lightly. Over the months, her comments had sometimes bordered on uncomfortable, especially when the topic of race or culture came up. Daniel often felt the weight of her gaze during these discussions, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Today's lesson was on the civil rights movement. The topic itself should have sparked meaningful dialogue, but from the moment Ms. Turner started talking, her tone felt off. She spoke about historical figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, but her words lacked empathy, as though she were reciting facts without understanding their significance. Then, as she moved on to discuss the struggles Black Americans faced during segregation, her comments began to take a strange turn. "So," Ms. Turner said, scanning the room, "does anyone here think these protests were really necessary? Or were people just overreacting?" A few students exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they were hearing her correctly. Some shrugged it off, assuming she was just trying to provoke a debate, but Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hesitated, unsure whether to speak up. But as silence filled the room, Ms. Turner's eyes landed directly on him. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharp, "you must have an opinion on this. After all, this is your history we're talking about." The room went still. Every eye turned toward Daniel. He could feel his classmates' stares, some curious, others sympathetic. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process her words. "Your history?" The implication behind her statement was as clear as it was insulting. Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing. He could let it go, like he had so many times before, or he could say something. But before he could decide, Ms. Turner pressed on. "No answer?" she said, her tone dripping with mock disappointment. "I thought you'd have something insightful to share. Or maybe I was wrong about you." The knot in Daniel's stomach twisted tighter. He glanced around the room, hoping anyone might step in. But his classmates avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, it felt like the walls of the classroom were closing in on him. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. "I think the protests were more than necessary. They were about fighting for basic human rights, something everyone should care about." Ms. Turner's lips curled into a thin smile. "Interesting perspective," she said, her tone icy. "But let me ask you this: do you think all the violence that came with those protests was justified? Or was it just an excuse for people to cause trouble?" The room went silent again. Daniel felt his cheeks flush as anger bubbled just beneath the surface. Before he could respond, Ms. Turner added, "It's easy to say these things were necessary when you're looking back, but imagine how disruptive it must have been for people just trying to live their lives. Think about that." Daniel clenched his fists under the desk, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He knew this wasn't just about a history lesson anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that cut to the core of who he was and what he stood for. But before he could say another word, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students began to gather their things, the tension dissipating slightly as they hurried out the door. Daniel stayed in his seat for a moment, his heart still pounding. Ms. Turner didn't look at him as she packed up her materials, but the smirk on her face was unmistakable. As Daniel finally stood to leave, one thought lingered in his mind: this wasn't over. Something had to change. And what happened next would leave everyone, including Ms. Turner, completely unprepared for the truth. The hallway was loud and bustling as Daniel stepped out of the classroom, but the noise felt distant, like it was coming from another world. His mind was still spinning from what had just happened. He replayed Ms. Turner's words over and over again, each one stinging more than the last. The way she singled him out, the way she made his history feel like it didn't belong to everyone. It wasn't the first time she'd said something offhand like that, but it was the first time it had hit this hard. As he walked to his locker, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw one of his classmates, Ava. She was one of the few people he could count on to have his back, though she rarely spoke up in class when things got tense. Her expression was a mix of concern and hesitation. "Hey," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That was messed up. Are you okay?" Daniel forced a small smile, shrugging as if to say it didn't bother him. But Ava wasn't convinced. "You don't have to pretend like it didn't matter," she said, her voice lowering. "The way she talked to you, it was wrong. She keeps doing this, and no one ever calls her out." Daniel sighed, leaning against the cool metal of his locker. "What's the point, Ava? If I say something, she'll just twist it around and make it seem like I'm overreacting. And if I don't, it's like I'm agreeing with her." Ava frowned, her eyes narrowing in thought. "What if you're not the only one who feels that way? I mean, I've heard other people talk about her. Maybe it's time someone does something about it." Daniel looked at her, skeptical but intrigued. "Like what?" "I don't know," Ava admitted. "But I think you should talk to someone about it. Maybe the principal, or even your parents. It's not just about today, Daniel. It's about all the little things she says and does that make people feel like they don't belong." Daniel nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd seen how things like this usually played out. People made excuses, brushed things under the rug, and nothing ever changed. But deep down, he knew Ava was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. Later that evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. His mom noticed his quietness right away. She was the kind of parent who could sense when something was wrong, even when Daniel didn't say a word. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently, setting down her fork. Daniel hesitated, unsure how much he wanted to share. But as he thought about Ms. Turner's smirk, the words spilled out. He told his mom everything about the class discussion, the way Ms. Turner had singled him out, and how it wasn't the first time she made him feel small. His mom listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every word. When he finished, she took a deep breath and said, "Daniel, what she did was unacceptable. You shouldn't have to deal with that, especially from someone who's supposed to be teaching you." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "But what can I do? If I say something, it'll just make things worse." "Not if we do it the right way," his mom said firmly. "This isn't just about you, Daniel. It's about making sure she doesn't do this to anyone else." The next day, Daniel walked into school feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. His mom had insisted on meeting with the principal, but the thought of sitting in that office and explaining everything made his stomach churn. Still, he knew it was the right thing to do. When the time came, Daniel found himself sitting across from Principal Harris, a tall, no-nonsense man with sharp features and a calm demeanor. His mom sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "Daniel," Principal Harris said, his tone serious but kind. "I appreciate you coming to me with this. I want you to know that we take these kinds of concerns very seriously. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" As Daniel recounted the events of the previous day, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. When he finished, Principal Harris nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. "I'm going to look into this matter right away. In the meantime, if anything else happens, I want you to come straight to me. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure what to expect. Would anything really change? Or would this just be another one of those situations where the adults made promises but nothing actually got better? As he left the office, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were still so many questions swirling in his mind, questions about Ms. Turner, about his classmates, and about what it would take to truly make a difference. But one thing was clear, he couldn't let this go. Not now, not ever. What happened next would test everything he thought he knew about fairness, courage, and standing up for what was right. The days following his meeting with Principal Harris were a blur. Daniel spent his time trying to focus on his schoolwork, but his mind was constantly drifting back to the incident with Ms. Turner. Every time he walked into her class, he felt the weight of her gaze on him, like she was waiting for him to make a mistake. He had hoped that things might settle down, that maybe the conversation with the principal would make Ms. Turner more mindful, but if anything, the tension seemed to have gotten worse. Ms. Turner's behavior shifted subtly but noticeably. She would call on Daniel more often, asking questions that were just challenging enough to make him feel singled out, but not enough for anyone else to notice. When he answered correctly, she'd offer a brief nod but rarely acknowledged his contributions in the same way she did with the other students. It was as if she were subtly punishing him for speaking out of turn, for standing up for what he believed in. One afternoon, when the class was discussing the aftermath of the civil rights movement, Ms. Turner made a comment that made Daniel's blood run cold. "I mean, sure, things got better for black people in some ways," she said, her tone casual, as if she were talking about the weather. "But in other ways, they still seem to be causing problems, don't you think? It's like they're still looking for reasons to be angry." Daniel's hands clenched into fists under his desk, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade around him. His classmates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unsure how to respond. No one spoke up. It was as if they were all afraid that acknowledging the injustice would only make things worse. "Do you agree, Daniel?" Ms. Turner's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and probing. It felt like a trap, like she wanted him to say something, anything that she could twist into an accusation of disrespect. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "No," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I don't think it's about being angry. It's about fighting for the rights that were denied for so long. It's about fairness." Ms. Turner's lips curled into a tight smile. "Fairness, huh? You really think things aren't fair now? Because, Daniel, you've been given every opportunity, just like everyone else. And yet, people still complain." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Daniel could feel his heart racing. It wasn't just about race anymore. It was about power, control, and how easy it was for someone in authority to manipulate a situation. He could see it now more clearly than ever. Ms. Turner wasn't just teaching history. She was shaping her students' perceptions of the world, and she wasn't interested in truth, she was interested in control. He glanced around the room, looking for support, but his classmates avoided his gaze, their eyes darting to the walls or the floor. He realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that many of them probably agreed with Ms. Turner, or at least didn't have the courage to stand up to her. They had learned to accept her version of reality, to quietly nod along because that was the easier choice. But for Daniel, the anger that had been building up inside him couldn't be ignored anymore. This wasn't just about one teacher's misguided opinions. This was about the culture of silence that allowed things like this to continue unchecked. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how many people, his friends, his peers, even his own family had learned to be complicit in their own way. It was as if everyone around him had been conditioned to believe that certain things were just how the world works. No one ever questioned it. And the few who did, like his mom, like Ava, were dismissed as troublemakers. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Daniel walked out with his head down, his mind racing. He felt isolated, as if he were the only one who could see through the cracks in the facade. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on, something that no one else seemed willing to confront. That evening, he sat in his room, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. He thought about what Ava had said, about how maybe he wasn't the only one who felt this way. What if other students felt just as trapped by Ms. Turner's behavior? What if they didn't know how to speak up, how to challenge the status quo? The next day, he approached Ava between classes. "I'm thinking about doing something," he said, his voice low but steady. "Maybe it's time we told more people what's been going on. Maybe it's time for everyone to know what she's really like." Ava raised an eyebrow, her expression thoughtful. "Are you sure you're ready for that? Once you go down that road, there's no turning back. You might make things worse for yourself. You know how she is." Daniel nodded. "I know. But I don't think I can just sit back and let her keep doing this. If no one else is going to speak up, then maybe we need to give them a reason to." The more Daniel thought about it, the more determined he became. He started gathering evidence, small things, like photos of the worksheets where Ms. Turner made racially charged comments or notes from classmates who had overheard her making dismissive remarks about black students. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something, he believed, was enough to start a conversation. As the days passed, Daniel's resolve only grew stronger. The more he learned about the subtle ways people could manipulate others, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one teacher. This was about a system, a culture that allowed individuals like Ms. Turner to exist in the first place. And if he was going to make a difference, he couldn't just go after one person, he had to go after the whole system. The thought of standing up to something so much bigger than himself terrified him, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The other students might turn against him. Ms. Turner would probably fight back harder than ever. But for the first time, Daniel felt like he had something to fight for. The stakes were higher than ever, and he couldn't turn back now. The days after Daniel began gathering his evidence felt like they were stretching into an eternity. He walked through the halls of the school with a weight in his chest, knowing that the moment he'd been preparing for was coming closer with each passing hour. There was an undeniable feeling in the air, a sense of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen but no one was willing to speak it out loud. Each class with Ms. Turner became a little more unbearable. He could feel her eyes on him, could sense the shift in the air whenever he raised his hand to answer a question or speak up in any way. She was watching him, testing him. Every word he said seemed to be scrutinized, as if she was just waiting for him to slip up, to give her something she could use against him. It wasn't just Ms. Turner's behavior that was starting to gnaw at Daniel, it was the silence of everyone else around him. His classmates had seen the same things he had. They had heard the same comments, witnessed the same unfair treatment. But they kept quiet. They let it slide, pretending not to notice or to care, as if it was easier to keep their heads down and avoid conflict. Daniel understood that fear, but it didn't make him feel less alone. Every day, the weight of standing up by himself seemed heavier. Ava had been supportive, but even she was starting to show signs of hesitation. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked one morning as they sat in the cafeteria, the noise of other students buzzing around them. "I mean, you're going up against someone who's got power. Ms. Turner has been here a long time, Daniel. People are going to rally around her, not you." Daniel's fingers tightened around his tray as he thought about her words. He had known the risks. He knew that standing up for what was right wasn't always going to be easy, and sometimes it came at a heavy cost. But the alternative, letting things go on the way they had been, felt impossible. "I have to do something," Daniel replied, his voice quiet but determined. "If I don't, then what's the point of anything? I can't just keep pretending it's not happening." Ava nodded, though her brow was furrowed with worry. "I get it. But you should be prepared. This could get ugly." The next morning, Daniel approached Principal Harris once again, his stomach tied in knots. He had everything ready: his notes, the screenshots of Ms. Turner's class materials, and even some statements from other students who had agreed to speak up. He had spent hours putting it all together, trying to make sure there were no holes, no inconsistencies in his story. The only thing left now was to go to the principal and tell him everything. When Daniel entered Harris's office, he found himself facing the man's stern but patient expression. "Daniel," Principal Harris said, motioning for him to sit down. "You've been persistent about this, haven't you?" Daniel sat down, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir. I've gathered some evidence. I think it's time we talked about Ms. Turner." Harris's eyes flickered with a hint of concern. "Go ahead." For the next few minutes, Daniel laid everything out: each comment Ms. Turner had made, the worksheets and assignments that had been tainted with her biased views, the way she made black students feel like their history didn't matter. He spoke without hesitation, as if the words had been building up inside him for months, waiting to be released. By the time he finished, his throat felt dry, but there was a sense of relief in knowing he had said everything he needed to. Harris sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he processed what Daniel had said. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. "I appreciate your courage in bringing this to me, Daniel," Harris said, his voice calm. "But you understand that we need to handle this carefully. Allegations like this are serious, and they need to be addressed properly. I'll need to investigate." Daniel nodded. "I understand, but I don't want this to just be swept under the rug. She can't keep getting away with it. People are afraid to say anything. I just want it to stop." Principal Harris gave him a long, thoughtful look. "I will do everything I can to look into this. But I need you to be patient. Things like this take time." As Daniel left the office, he felt a mix of emotions. He was relieved to have finally spoken up, to have put everything out in the open, but the uncertainty of what would happen next weighed heavily on him. Would Harris take him seriously? Would he stand up to Ms. Turner? Or would this all just be another instance of things getting ignored, brushed aside like so many times before? The next few days felt like a slow-motion car crash. The tension between Daniel and Ms. Turner escalated even further. She seemed to take every opportunity to undermine him, making passive-aggressive comments during class, even giving him lower marks on assignments that had previously earned him top grades. It was like she was trying to push him to the edge, to make him snap. The rest of the students were starting to notice, but no one was brave enough to say anything. They would glance at Daniel, then quickly look away, as if avoiding his eyes could make the discomfort disappear. The silence was deafening, and it became clear that Daniel was walking this path alone. But despite the mounting pressure, Daniel didn't back down. The thought of giving up never crossed his mind. The injustice he'd experienced and witnessed, the way Ms. Turner used her power to belittle and control, had ignited something inside him. He couldn't stop now, no matter how much it seemed like the world was against him. One afternoon, as Daniel walked out of history class, he heard a voice calling after him. It was one of his classmates, a girl named Riley, someone he'd never really spoken to before. "Hey, Daniel, wait up." He turned around, surprised. Riley had always been quiet in class, but there was something different in her eyes now. "What's up?" "I heard what you're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I want you to know I think you're right. Ms. Turner." She's been doing stuff like that for a while. It's not just you. Daniel felt a small flicker of hope at her words, but he also knew the risk she was taking by speaking up. Are you sure you want to get involved? It's going to get messy. Riley nodded. I'm in. But we have to be careful. People are talking, but no one wants to do anything. I think we can change that. Just when Daniel thought things might finally be starting to turn around, he received a message that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Ava, and the message was simple, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You need to be careful. Ms. Turner is talking to the principal. She knows you've been going behind her back. The ground felt like it was slipping beneath him. The tension had reached its peak, and the final showdown was about to begin. What would happen when Ms. Turner fought back? Would Principal Harris stand by him, or would he side with the teacher? Everything Daniel had worked for was hanging by a thread, and now, with Riley's support, he had a choice to make. Would he confront Ms. Turner head-on, risking everything? Or would he find another way to expose the truth before it was too late? The clock was ticking, and the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The moment Daniel read Ava's message, he felt a sudden knot form in his stomach. It wasn't just the fact that Ms. Turner was going to the principal, though that was bad enough. It was the way Ava had worded it, the urgency in her message. She knows you've been going behind her back. That sent a chill through him. He had been careful, meticulous even, making sure to document everything without ever directly confronting her. But now, the reality of what he was up against hit him hard. He couldn't afford to let Ms. Turner get the upper hand. Not now. He had worked too hard, made too many sacrifices, and put his faith in people who, up until now, had kept their silence. But silence wasn't going to change anything. Silence had only allowed Ms. Turner's toxicity to continue for so long. He knew that if he backed down now, if he let her manipulate this situation, it would be the end of everything he had fought for. But what was the right move? His thoughts were racing, and the halls of the school felt like they were closing in on him. He couldn't stop thinking about Riley. She had spoken up, but how many others had felt the same way but kept quiet? How many people were out there who knew what was happening but were too scared to risk speaking up? If he went any further, if he challenged Ms. Turner directly, it wouldn't just be about him anymore, it would involve everyone who had ever quietly suffered under her harsh rule. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, the darkness pressing in on him. He had his evidence, he had his supporters, but so did Ms. Turner. What if she had been planning this from the beginning? What if, all along, she had been keeping track of every student who dared to speak out, every whisper that floated through the halls? Just as the thought crossed his mind, he heard a soft knock at his window. His heart skipped. It was late, way past curfew. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled open the blinds, finding Riley standing outside, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "What's going on?" Daniel whispered, quickly opening the window to let her in. Riley stepped inside, her face tense and pale, a deep worry in her eyes. "You need to listen to me. This is bigger than we thought." Daniel frowned, his pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" "I overheard something today," she began, glancing over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching. "Ms. Turner. She's been gathering information on all the students who've been involved in this. She knows who's been questioning her, who's been talking to the principal, and she's not going to let it slide. She's planning to make a move." Daniel felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. He had known there was more to this, but hearing it from Riley, hearing the certainty in her voice, made it all feel real. He hadn't realized how far Ms. Turner was willing to go to protect herself. This wasn't just about a teacher's pride anymore, it was about power, control, and the lengths someone would go to keep their secrets hidden. "What's she going to do?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She's planning to turn this around on you, Riley said. She's going to accuse you of lying, of trying to sabotage her career. She's already started talking to people, trying to paint you as the problem. And she has influence, Daniel. She's been here too long. If she convinces the principal that you're the one causing trouble, everything you've worked for could backfire. Daniel's stomach churned. He had been prepared for a fight, but not like this. He had been focused on getting the truth out, on showing everyone what was happening, but now it felt like the truth itself was being twisted. Ms. Turner wasn't just going to sit idly by and let him expose her. She was going to fight back, and she had the experience and the connections to make it hurt. What can we do? Daniel asked, his mind racing. We can't let her get away with this. We can't just let her ruin everything. Riley took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the weight of what she was about to say. There's something else. Ms. Turner. She's been playing everyone. I overheard her talking to one of the other teachers. She's been feeding them a story about you, making it look like you've been instigating all this trouble for personal reasons. She's trying to turn people against you, make you look unstable. And she's pretty convincing. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The walls seemed to close in around him. He had never anticipated anything like this. What if he wasn't strong enough to handle the pressure? What if he couldn't stop Ms. Turner from manipulating everything in her favor? Just then, his phone buzzed on his desk. He quickly picked it up, his heart racing again when he saw the notification. It was from Principal Harris. We need to meet. Tomorrow, first thing. Come to my office. The tension in Daniel's chest spiked. The timing was too perfect. Ms. Turner had likely already spoken to Harris, and now, this was his moment of reckoning. Would Harris side with him, or would he be drawn into Ms. Turner's web of lies? Riley looked at Daniel, her eyes full of concern. This isn't just about you anymore. If you go in there tomorrow, you have to be ready for everything. Ms. Turner isn't going to let you walk away from this without a fight. Daniel's mind was spinning. He had done everything he could think of to prepare for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the turn things had taken. Ms. Turner wasn't just going to let him expose her. She was going to destroy him if she had to. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the principal's office with a tightness in his chest that felt unbearable. He had already thought about all the ways this could go good and bad, but nothing could calm the anxiety building up in him. The door to Harris's office opened with a soft click, and Daniel stepped inside, taking a seat across from the principal's desk. The look in Harris's eyes was unreadable. Daniel, I've had a chance to hear both sides of this situation, he began, his voice calm but firm. I understand you've made some serious accusations against Ms. Turner, but I need you to know that this is not something I take lightly. I need to be sure about what's happening here. Daniel's stomach twisted in knots. The words he had prepared all week seemed to disappear. Would Harris believe him, or had Ms. Turner already convinced him that Daniel was the real problem? Before he could say anything, the door to the office opened again, and Ms. Turner stepped inside. She was calm, collected, her posture perfect. But there was something in the way she walked into the room that made Daniel's skin crawl. She knew this moment would come, and now, she was ready to take him down. The tension between them was palpable, and Daniel could feel the stakes rise higher than ever. This wasn't just about a teacher and a student anymore. This was about the battle for the truth, for control, and for what kind of person Daniel wanted to be in this moment. He was standing at the edge of something far bigger than himself, and as Ms. Turner met his eyes with a cold smile, he knew that the final confrontation was about to begin. The moment Ms. Turner stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. Daniel could feel her eyes cutting through him like a blade, calculating and cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was at the final moment of truth. Everything he had worked for, all the sleepless nights, the fear of being crushed under Ms. Turner's manipulative tactics, had led up to this one point. But the room felt smaller than ever. Principal Harris leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the desk in front of him. "I've heard a lot about what's been going on, Daniel. Now it's time to make sure I have all the facts." His voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the underlying tension. He was walking a tightrope. One wrong move could send everything crashing down. Ms. Turner stood with a quiet confidence, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I appreciate you taking the time to listen, Principal Harris," she said smoothly, her tone as calm as ever. "I know that these kinds of situations can be difficult, but I assure you, I've done nothing wrong. I've been teaching for over 15 years. I have a spotless record." Her eyes flickered over to Daniel, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Daniel has always been an outstanding student, until recently. And now, he's making unfounded accusations against me. All I've ever done is teach my class." Daniel swallowed, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. He had prepared for this, but the calmness in Ms. Turner's voice felt like a trap, one he wasn't sure he could escape from. "I'm not lying," he finally said, his voice clear despite the nerves running through him. "I have proof. Everything I've said is the truth. I've shown it to you already." Ms. Turner didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost bored. "And yet, Mr. Harris, there's no record of these so-called unfair practices until Daniel brought them up. You're going to have to ask yourself, why now? Why would he suddenly start making accusations out of the blue? What's his real motive?" Daniel felt the weight of her words settle heavily in the room. He knew exactly what she was doing, trying to make him look unstable, to make him seem like the one with an agenda. The thought was terrifying. What if Harris believed her? What if he sided with Ms. Turner, as so many others had done in the past? But just as the room seemed to close in on him, something unexpected happened. Riley, who had been waiting just outside the office, pushed the door open and stepped inside, her expression firm and determined. "That's not true," she said, her voice steady but loud enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "I've seen it too." Principal Harris turned sharply, clearly caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I've seen how Ms. Turner treats students," Riley continued, her voice growing more confident with each word. "I've witnessed it firsthand. She's been singling out certain students, making them feel worthless, teaching history in a way that erases their experiences. And it's not just Daniel. She's done this to others too." The silence in the room was deafening as everyone processed what Riley had just revealed. Ms. Turner's mask slipped for just a moment, her eyes widening, her composure faltering. But it didn't last long. She quickly regained her poise, though now there was a hint of uncertainty in her gaze. "You can't seriously believe this," Ms. Turner said, her voice growing tense. "This is a student trying to ruin my career. You're listening to a few disgruntled kids who have an agenda. You really think they can't twist the truth?" But Riley wasn't done. "It's not just us," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You think no one noticed? You think we didn't hear what you were saying to other teachers? We've been talking, and we know exactly what you've been doing." For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing. Principal Harris sat back in his chair, his eyes shifting between Daniel and Riley, his face unreadable. Daniel felt the cold rush of adrenaline, but he also felt something else: hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally getting through to him. Ms. Turner glared at Riley, her face contorted in fury. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is an attack on my reputation, on my livelihood. And I won't stand for it." Harris's gaze turned stern. "Enough," he said, his voice a commanding force that cut through the tension. "I've heard enough. I'll be conducting a full investigation into these allegations. Ms. Turner, I expect you to cooperate fully." The shock on Ms. Turner's face was unmistakable. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The calm facade she had maintained for so long was cracking, and for the first time, Daniel saw a glimpse of the woman behind the mask. He saw the anger, the desperation, the need to keep control. And it scared him. But before anything else could be said, the principal turned to Daniel. "I want to thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said, his tone a little softer now. "I know this wasn't easy. You've shown a lot of courage." Then he turned to Riley, nodding in acknowledgement. "Both of you." For a moment, everything hung in the air. Daniel felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for anything to happen. But then Harris spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension. "I want you both to know that I take these matters seriously. I'll make sure that everything is looked into, and I'll be in touch with you both soon. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you both to stay out of this situation while the investigation unfolds." With that, the room seemed to exhale, the weight of the confrontation lifting, but not completely. It wasn't over. Not yet. Harris was doing his part, but Daniel knew that this wasn't a simple victory. This was just the beginning. As Daniel and Riley walked out of the principal's office together, the weight of what had just happened started to sink in. They had done it. They had stood up, they had fought back, and now, the truth was out in the open. But there was still one lingering thought in Daniel's mind. He had come this far, but was it enough? Was the battle really over? As he looked over at Riley, a strange sense of unease settled over him. Something didn't feel right, like there was another layer to this story that hadn't been uncovered yet. And then, as they walked down the hall toward the exit, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Ava or any of the others who had supported him. It was a number he didn't recognize. Curious, he answered it, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "You think this is over, Daniel? You're wrong. Ms. Turner isn't the real threat. Keep looking, and you'll find the truth. But not everything you want to know will come without a price." Daniel froze, the blood draining from his face. His hand trembled as he held the phone. Who was this? What did they mean? And what was the price? The line went dead. The final twist had come, and Daniel realized with a chilling certainty, he hadn't uncovered everything. The story was far from over. Daniel stood frozen, his phone still pressed to his ear as the mysterious voice cut through the silence. The line had gone dead, but the words still echoed in his mind. The real threat. What did it mean? Who had just called, and why did they think Ms. Turner wasn't the real problem? He felt a deep unease settle into his chest. This wasn't over. He had won a battle, but the war? The war was just beginning. Riley, sensing his shift in demeanor, looked at him with concern. What's wrong? She asked, her voice quiet, almost fearful. Daniel lowered the phone, staring at the screen for a moment before answering. I don't know. Someone just called, but they didn't say who they were. They said, Ms. Turner isn't the real threat. He paused, trying to process the implications of the statement. I don't know what that means. Riley's face paled, and she stepped closer. What if this whole thing is bigger than just her? She asked, her voice trembling. What if someone else is behind all of this? Someone who's pulling the strings. The thought made Daniel's stomach churn. It was a possibility he hadn't considered. They had focused so much on Ms. Turner, but what if there was someone else, a bigger, more powerful force that had been manipulating everything from the shadows? What if they were only seeing the tip of the iceberg? I need to find out who called, Daniel said, his mind racing. I need to know what they know, and I need to figure out who's behind this. For the next few days, Daniel barely slept. Every spare moment he had, he spent researching the phone number, trying to trace the call, but it led to a dead end. It was as if the voice had never existed. It was frustrating, maddening even. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. As much as he wanted to focus on the investigation into Ms. Turner, he couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that someone, somewhere, was still watching, still pulling the strings. Then, one evening, as Daniel was going over some of the evidence again, he received another message. This time, it was a simple text: "Meet me at the old school library. We need to talk. Alone." His heart raced. Could it be the same person? Was this his chance to get some answers? He knew he couldn't ignore it. He told Riley what had happened, and though she was reluctant, she understood that Daniel needed to follow this lead. She insisted on coming along, but Daniel refused. "I need to do this alone," he said. "I'll be careful." The old library was dimly lit and filled with the musty smell of old books. It was a place many students avoided, especially after dark, but Daniel knew it was the perfect spot for something secretive. He walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and found the door to the library slightly ajar. Inside, the faint light of a single desk lamp illuminated a figure sitting at one of the tables. The person's back was to him, but Daniel recognized the outline. It was Ms. Turner. "Ms. Turner?" Daniel asked, his voice a mix of confusion and caution. She turned slowly, her face unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence. "You've been asking questions, Daniel," she said, her voice calm but laced with something else, something darker. "Questions you should have never asked?" Daniel took a step forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? What's going on here? Who called me?" She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, almost as if she was letting go of something heavy. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's not about me, Daniel. It's never been about me. You've been looking in the wrong places, wasting your time." Daniel's confusion deepened. "Then what is this about? What's going on?" She leaned forward, her voice softening. "There's someone else, someone much more powerful than I am, pulling the strings. The system you've been trying to expose isn't just a few bad teachers. It's an entire network, a system built on control and manipulation. And you've been a pawn in it all along." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His mind raced, trying to process everything she was saying. A network? A system? This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. Ms. Turner's eyes darkened. "I didn't want to be part of it, but I was. Just like you are now. You thought you could fight back, but you don't know what you're up against. They control everything. They know everything." Daniel shook his head, disbelieving. "Who are they? What do you want from me?" She leaned back in her chair, studying him with a cold gaze. "I'm trying to protect you, Daniel. You're not the only one who's been targeted. The truth you're trying to uncover is dangerous. It's not just about a racist teacher anymore. It's about everything about the system itself. You think you're making a difference, but you're just digging deeper into a hole you can't escape from." Daniel's thoughts spun out of control. He had known this wasn't going to be easy, but he never imagined it would be like this. He had always been told that if he worked hard enough, if he fought for what was right, things would change. But now, it seemed like the very idea of justice was slipping through his fingers. Ms. Turner stood up, her posture rigid. "I'm telling you this because I'm trying to give you a choice. You can walk away from this. You can drop the investigation, leave the school, and forget this ever happened. Or you can keep pushing, and they'll make sure you regret it." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and now, there was no turning back. He could walk away, disappear, and try to live a normal life, or he could keep fighting. He thought about everything: the students who had suffered, the people who had been silenced, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up. He thought about Riley, and how much she had risked to help him. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I'm not walking away. I'm not going to let them win." Ms. Turner looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the library, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of her warning. For a moment, he stood there, breathing deeply, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. He had made his choice. Now, it was time to take the fight to them. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and carefully gathered evidence. Daniel worked tirelessly, uncovering connections between certain administrators, teachers, and influential figures in the district. It was all part of a larger system, one that sought to suppress the truth and maintain control. But Daniel wasn't alone in this fight. He had the support of the other students, some teachers who were willing to risk everything, and most importantly, Riley. The investigation wasn't easy. It was dangerous, and there were times when Daniel felt like he was losing everything: his reputation, his safety, his peace of mind. But through it all, he never gave up. Eventually, the truth came to light. The corrupt system that had been hidden for so long was exposed, and the community rallied together to demand change. The teachers who had been complicit were held accountable, and the district underwent an overhaul. It was a long, hard-fought victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the dust settled, Daniel looked back on everything he had learned. The journey had been difficult, filled with pain, doubt, and fear. But it had also been a journey of growth, of discovering who he truly was, and what he was capable of when he stood up for what was right. He had uncovered more than just a racist teacher. He had uncovered a system built on silence and fear. And he had learned the most important lesson of all: the truth always comes to light, even when the path is dark and uncertain. And as he walked out of the school for the last time, with Riley by his side, he knew that no matter what came next, he would never stop fighting for what was right.